The galaxy was old. Civilizations had risen and fallen long before humanity ever looked at the stars. To the mighty empires, humans were a young species. Too fragile, too untested, too small to matter. When the humans built their first ships and sent them into the void, the galaxy barely noticed. And when they began to arm those ships, to weld steel and mount guns on their hulls, the galaxy laughed. A child's toys, alien admirals said with mocking smiles. A fragile race with fragile dreams. Humanity heard it all. Every insult, every sneer. They remembered how alien fleets pushed them aside, how merchants from stronger worlds exploited their colonies, how pirate bands burned their outposts while the empires looked away. They remembered the helplessness, the powerlessness, and the shame. Each slight was carved deep into their hearts, and each scar became a promise. Never again would humanity kneel. The first human warships were ugly machines compared to the sleek cruisers of the empires. Their armor was uneven. Their designs looked more industrial than elegant. And when humanity introduced its small strike craft, the gunships, the galaxy mocked louder than ever. Gunships? What can these fragile little things do against our dreadnoughts? The alien rulers laughed. To them it was like watching ants charge a predator. But what the galaxy failed to see was the spirit welded into those ships. Gunships were not meant to be pretty. They were not meant to inspire awe by their shape. They were built to survive. They were built to fight dirty, to strike hard, to endure what no other craft could. They were built with human stubbornness carved into their steel. Each gunship carried too many weapons for its size. Engines that screamed at their limits and armor patched together by engineers who refused to give up. In their hangars, pilots strapped themselves into cockpits not knowing if they would ever return. Mothers kissed their children goodbye. Soldiers whispered prayers to stars they might never see again. Yet still they flew. Still they volunteered. For the survival of their people. For the pride of their kind, for the fire burning inside them. Alien empires laughed from their marble halls. They thought of humanity as a nuisance, at best a curiosity. They measured strength only in numbers and in the size of their flagships. They never understood the will of the human heart. Humanity had no illusions. They knew their fleets were small, their resources limited, their losses heavy. But they also knew something the galaxy did not. Wars are not always won by size. Wars are not always won by power. Sometimes wars are won by those who refuse to stop fighting, no matter the cost. And so the hangars roared with the thunder of engines. The void shook with the growl of human steel. Where the galaxy saw toys, humans saw wolves. Where the galaxy saw weakness, humans saw a weapon carved from fire and desperation. This was the quiet before the storm, a silence heavy with fury, full of whispered vows. Humanity would wait no longer. When the void finally called, they answered not with fear, not with surrender, but with iron in their hands and fire blazing in their eyes. The first human gunships were nothing like the galaxy had seen before. They were small, fast, and dangerous. To alien eyes they looked unrefined, even crude. Compared to the shining cruisers and polished dreadnoughts of the empires, these human ships seemed like scraps of metal stitched together with stubborn hands. But there was something different about them. Something alive in the way they moved through space. They carried the will of their people, and that made them stronger than they appeared. At first, the galaxy dismissed the gunships as little more than pests. Admirals waved their claws or tendrils, laughing as reports came in about tiny human ships darting near their borders. A nuisance, they said. An irritation. But those same admirals did not laugh for long. The nuisance grew sharper. The irritation turned into pain. Supply convoys began to vanish. Patrol fleets failed to return. Every few weeks there were new whispers of ambushes in the dark, of fire bursting out of silence. The gunships struck with precision. They did not fight long, drawn-out battles they could not win. Instead, they hunted. They moved like predators, choosing the moment to attack and vanishing before the enemy could strike back. A convoy of fuel tankers would slip into human space, confident in its escort of warships. But by the time the convoy reached its destination, the tankers were burning wrecks and the escorts were reduced to drifting corpses. No one ever saw the gunships arrive. They were simply there like shadows with teeth. Alien commanders grew frustrated. They launched more fleets, larger fleets, determined to crush this insignificant species once and for all. But with every new invasion, the same story repeated. The gunships were everywhere. They slipped through blind spots, hid in asteroid fields, and attacked in swarms too fast to predict. When one ship fell, two more struck back harder. The humans did not fight cleanly. They did not fight politely. They fought to survive, and their courage spread like fire. Across human space, people who once felt powerless began to believe again. Colonists on distant worlds, who once feared the alien empires, now whispered stories of human pilots who could tear apart ships 100 times their size. Children painted gunships on walls. Workers in factories cried with pride as they tightened the bolts on a new engine, knowing it would soon roar into the void to defend them. Humanity was no longer waiting for someone to save them. They had become their own salvation. For the pilots, life inside a gunship was brutal. The cockpits were cramped, the engines screamed endlessly, and the odds were always against them. But still they flew. Every pilot carried the weight of their people on their shoulders. Every mission was a gamble, but one they accepted without hesitation. Many did not return. Their names were etched into steel walls inside hangars, long lines of sacrifice that grew longer with each battle, and yet when one pilot fell, another stepped forward to take their place. The galaxy began to notice. Fear spread quietly at first, carried by the whispers of traders and soldiers who had seen the gunships up close. Some called them phantoms, others called them wolves of the void. The name spread faster than truth, and soon entire fleets hesitated to enter human space. Captains looked over their shoulders, afraid of what might be waiting in the dark. The proud empires, once certain of their power, now found themselves unsettled. The humans did not care for titles or names. They did not need the galaxy's respect. All they needed was to protect their people, to strike back at those who thought themselves untouchable. And so the raids continued. Every successful strike carved a message into the stars. Humanity was rising, and they would not stop. What began as laughter in the halls of alien admirals had turned into silence. And that silence carried with it something heavier, something the galaxy had not felt in generations. It was fear. The first shiver of fear that the balance of power was changing, and that the small, underestimated species from a blue world might just reshape the destiny of the stars. The storm was no longer rising. It had already begun. The Battle of Draxus Rift began like so many others before it. An alien flagship, vast as a floating city, led a fleet of warships into human space. The empire that owned it had grown arrogant from centuries of easy conquest. To them, humanity was a stone in their path, small, sharp perhaps, but nothing their boots could not crush. The flagship's hull gleamed under the light of a distant sun, shields humming with pride, weapons charged and ready. Its admiral was certain the battle would be short. On the ground below, human colonies watched the invasion with fear. Families gathered in shelters, eyes fixed on the skies. They prayed their defenders would hold, though in their hearts they knew the enemy ships outnumbered them 10-1. Still, they whispered the same name again and again, the gunships. Then the shadows came. They appeared from the black like hunting wolves. Dozens of human gunships, small and quick, emerging from the debris fields around the rift. They carried no banners, no shining armor, only the raw strength of their engines and the fury of their pilots. The flagship's scanners picked them up too late. By the time alarms screamed, the gunships had already struck. The first wave tore through the escorts. Alien cruisers fired desperately, their beams slicing the void, but the gunships moved too fast. They darted into blind spots, cut across firing arcs, and poured fire into the weakest points of armor. One by one, the escorts fell. A cruiser split in half, its burning core spilling across the stars. Another was left crippled, spinning helplessly until a second gunship volley finished it. The flagship thundered with anger. Its weapons unleashed storms of plasma, arcs of destruction that could vaporize cities. Entire asteroids shattered in its fury. A handful of gunships were caught in the fire, turned into bright, brief sparks. But the rest did not retreat. They swarmed tighter, weaving between the flagship's guns like hornets around a beast too large to strike them all. Inside the flagship's command deck, the admiral bellowed orders. "Focus fire! Crush them! They are insects!" Yet his voice carried cracks of fear. He watched his escorts vanish from the display one after another. His proud fleet, the pride of his empire, was being torn apart by ships he had called toys. The gunships moved with deadly purpose. Their pilots knew the flagship's weak points, the vents, the shield generators, the lines where armor was thinner. Each pilot had memorized the schematics, practiced the maneuvers until their hands moved by instinct. They struck in waves, hammering one target after another, retreating only to circle back for another bite. Finally, the flagship's shields faltered. Sparks erupted across its hull as the barriers failed. Human pilots cheered through broken comms, their voices hoarse with exhaustion and fire. Now, cried one, and the gunships obeyed. They clawed at the great ship's belly, stripping away armor plate by plate. Explosions rolled across its length. The admiral screamed defiance, refusing to believe what was happening. But no amount of pride could hold back the storm. The final blow came when a pair of gunships dove straight into the flagship's reactor vents. They were hit, burning, half destroyed, but their torpedoes struck true. For a breathless second, the void went silent. Then the flagship cracked apart. The explosion lit the rift in fire. A ship that had once been a symbol of invincibility was reduced to drifting wreckage, its proud banners turned to ash. Colonists watching from the ground cried out in joy and grief at once, knowing lives had been lost but salvation had come. The galaxy felt the tremor that day. For the first time, a human swarm of gunships had shattered an empire's flagship. The story spread faster than any fleet could fly. Admirals who had once laughed now fell silent. Pilots who had once sneered now dreamed of the shadows that might hunt them next. The hunters of the galaxy had become the hunted, and humanity, underestimated no more, had carved its first scar into the empires that had mocked them. The destruction of the flagship at Draxus Rift echoed across the galaxy like thunder. No one had expected it. Not the colonies who prayed for survival, not the human commanders who sent their gunships into the dark, and certainly not the alien empires who believed their fleets were untouchable. The rift still burned with the wreckage, but already the story was spreading. A mighty flagship, symbol of alien pride, had been shattered by a swarm of human gunships. At first, the admirals of the great empires dismissed it as luck. An accident, they said. A single battle gone wrong. But deep inside, fear stirred. Flagships were not supposed to fall. They were built to last centuries, built to carry entire wars on their steel backs. If one could be destroyed, then none of them were safe, and the gunships did not stop. They haunted the edges of space like ghosts. No matter how many fleets were sent, the pattern repeated. The invaders would march in, proud and confident, only to find themselves hunted. Convoys vanished. Warships burned. Fleets broke apart, not in great battles, but in 1,000 small cuts. It was not just strength, it was relentlessness. The gunships gave their enemies no rest, no chance to breathe. Alien commanders tried new strategies. They sent larger fleets, escorts packed tightly around their flagships. They deployed traps, scattering decoys to lure the gunships out, but the humans had learned to fight with cunning. They did not charge into open fire. They struck where the enemy was weakest. Supply ships, communication relays, isolated escorts, and then vanished back into the dark. For every trap set, the gunships set one of their own. For every fleet sent, another graveyard of twisted wreckage was left behind. Whispers spread among the alien crews. At first it was quiet, spoken only in fear between soldiers. But soon it reached the admirals themselves. The humans fight like wolves, they said. They wait, they circle, and then they strike together. Others spoke of the endless raids as if the gunships were spirits, phantoms of the void who could not be stopped. Some crews refused to sail near human systems at all. Even the most disciplined soldiers grew restless, always glancing into the dark, always afraid of what might be waiting. In the grand halls of the empires, leaders debated in hushed voices. Once they had laughed at humanity. Now their laughter was gone. Treaties, alliances, and strategies were whispered over tables where pride once ruled. The question was no longer, can we defeat them? But how do we survive them? Yet for humanity, the war was no story of triumph alone. Every victory cost lives. Every raid meant empty seats at family tables, names carved into walls of remembrance. Pilots knew that flying a gunship was often a one-way mission, but they flew anyway. Their courage was the fuel that kept the fight alive, and their sacrifice only made humanity more determined. Still, the fear in the galaxy grew heavier with each passing month. Colonies far from the conflict heard the tales and looked to the skies differently. Traders whispered of human fleets appearing and disappearing like storms. Alien merchants carried rumors that human gunships had been seen as far as sectors they had never entered. The truth mattered less than the belief, and the belief was enough to break morale. The proud empires had always believed power came from size, from the number of ships in their fleets, from the thickness of their armor. But now they faced an enemy that proved size was not everything. Humanity fought with will, with cunning, with fire in their hearts. And for the first time in generations, the galaxy felt something it had forgotten: fear of the unknown. The hunters had become the hunted, and the wolves of the void were not finished yet. Victory was never free. For every alien flagship that shattered, for every fleet that crumbled, humanity paid a price in blood. The galaxy spoke of the fearless gunships as if they were unstoppable spirits. But inside the cockpits were men and women with beating hearts, with families, with dreams they knew might never be fulfilled. The life of a gunship pilot was short, brutal, and heavy with sacrifice. The cockpits were small cages where a person sat strapped to steel, surrounded by endless alarms and the constant roar of engines. There was no comfort, no safety. They flew knowing each mission could be their last. The statistics were cruel. Many did not return, and those who did came back scarred in body and soul. In the hangars, the truth was carved into walls. Long lists of names etched into metal panels. The fallen pilots, the missing, the lost. Each new raid meant more names, more empty bunks, more silent tables in homes across human space. Families learned to live with the ache of absence. Mothers kissed their children goodbye without knowing if they would ever see them again. Wives and husbands clung to one last embrace before the engines roared and swallowed their loved ones into the void. And yet, the pilots never stopped. They carried their fear like a hidden weight, but their courage burned brighter. For them, this was not just war. It was survival. They knew that if they did not fly, humanity would kneel again under alien boots. Better to burn in the void than to live as slaves. Commanders in control rooms watched their pilots leave, knowing many would not return. Engineers worked through sleepless nights, bleeding from their hands as they welded broken ships back together. Every bolt tightened was an act of love. Every scratch polished off a hull was a prayer for survival. The factories that birthed the gunships became temples of sacrifice, where ordinary workers poured their lives into machines that would carry strangers into battle. But even as victories piled up, the cost grew heavier. Pilots joked in grim voices that the life of a gunship warrior was measured not in years, but in missions. They kept their humor sharp because it was the only shield against despair. Some painted symbols on their ships: wolves, phantoms, burning suns, small marks of individuality in a war that consumed names too quickly. Others recorded messages before each flight, last words for the families they might never see again. Every time a squadron launched, humanity held its breath. And every time wreckage returned with fewer ships than had left, humanity wept, but only for a moment. Then they steeled their hearts again. For every loss made them fiercer, more relentless. They swore to honor the fallen not with tears alone, but with fire. Even alien spies who watched from the shadows reported this strange resilience. The humans should have broken by now, they whispered. Their losses should crush them. But instead, the opposite was true. The more they bled, the stronger they became. Grief turned into steel, sorrow into resolve. Pilots often said the same words before missions. Words passed like a prayer. For those who fell before us, we will fly again. The galaxy saw the victories. They saw the fear spreading among admirals and warlords, but they did not see the pain behind those victories. The endless funerals, the children growing up with only pictures of parents, the hangars lined with silent helmets that would never be worn again. This was the price of fury. Humanity knew it well, and yet they paid it willingly. For them, the cost was worth it if it meant no empire would ever again mock their weakness. No warlord would ever again enslave their kind. The wolves of the void howled not just from pride but from sacrifice, and the galaxy trembled, not knowing how much more humanity was willing to give. The galaxy had thought itself eternal. The great empires believed their rule would never falter, that their fleets were too mighty, their power too absolute. But after Draxus' rift, after the endless raids, after the convoys burned and the escorts vanished, that certainty began to crumble. The balance was shifting and all could feel it. Once alien ambassadors had sneered when they spoke to human diplomats. They used soft tones like one would use with children. Now their voices trembled, their words chosen with care. They did not laugh anymore. They offered agreements, treaties, and promises they had never before considered. The humans, they realized, were no longer a weak neighbor. They were a rising force, and their gunships haunted the void like a storm that could not be stopped. The proud warlords who had mocked humanity now lowered their eyes when human representatives entered the chamber. Entire fleets that once marched confidently into human space hesitated, unwilling to risk becoming the next ghost story told in frightened barracks. For every empire that once declared humanity beneath them, there was now a new voice whispering, "Treat with them. Do not provoke them. Do not wake the wolves." But humanity did not trust easily. They had learned the hard way that words could be false, that smiles could hide knives. Even as treaties were signed, even as alien leaders bowed in caution, the gunships still flew. They still patrolled the edges of space, their engines humming like watchful hearts, their weapons ready. Humanity would not be caught off guard again. The shift was not just political, it was spiritual. On human worlds once weighed down by fear, people now stood taller. Colonists who had lived under the shadow of alien greed now raised their flags with pride. Children no longer played pretend as alien warriors. They drew gunships with crayons, calling them heroes. The very soul of humanity had changed. They were no longer the underestimated. They were no longer the fragile. They had become something new, a people feared and respected. Still, the cost was remembered. Every victory had been written with blood. Every new treaty was signed with the weight of lives lost in cockpits too small to hold such sacrifice. The lists of names etched into hangar walls continued to grow, and humanity carried that sorrow as carefully as they carried their pride. It was a reminder that freedom was never free, that respect in the galaxy had been bought at the highest price. Among the alien empires, fear grew into something deeper: hesitation. Commanders delayed their invasions. Merchants demanded higher pay to travel near human space. Entire sectors shifted their trade routes, unwilling to risk the dark where the gunships prowled. What once had been seen as weak, unworthy, and laughable now cast long shadows across the stars. The galaxy had changed. Humanity had forced it to change. Where once they had begged for recognition, now others bent to meet them. Where once they had been mocked, now their silence carried more weight than any admiral's speech. But humanity did not celebrate. They did not boast. They simply prepared. They knew the empires would never forget their shame. They knew fear could turn to vengeance and that prideful rulers would always seek to reclaim their power. So the gunships stayed sharp, their patrols endless. In the silence of deep space, the hum of human engines was a warning. We are watching. We are ready. Never again will we kneel. The galaxy shifted on its axis, and for the first time it revolved around humanity's defiance. The war did not end with a single battle. It did not end with a single treaty, nor with the fall of one empire. It ended slowly, like fire consuming dry wood, until nothing was left of the arrogance that had once ruled the stars. Humanity's defiance became more than a story. It became a legend whispered in every corridor of power, on every world, in every shadowed barracks where soldiers feared the night. Alien admirals once stood proud, their uniforms heavy with medals earned through centuries of conquest. Now those same admirals bent their knees in silence, forced to bow before human councils, offering words they never thought they would speak: surrender, respect, and apology. Their fleets, once vast, were broken pieces scattered across the void, their power undone by small, relentless gunships that should never have been able to win. For the pilots, the war's end was not a celebration. They had lost too much, given too much. They stood in hangars staring at walls carved with names, lists that stretched endlessly, shining under dim lights. Friends, siblings, parents, all reduced to lines of steel letters that no hand could ever erase. Victory had been bought, but the price of it was unbearable. Still, they stood tall because they knew the sacrifice had not been in vain. Humanity had secured its place in the galaxy. No longer were they dismissed as fragile or weak. No longer were they mocked as a species unfit for the stars. The galaxy had learned that humans were iron-willed, stubborn, and unyielding. They were not conquerors by choice, but when forced, they became storms that could not be contained. The colonists, the farmers, the workers, ordinary people who once lived in fear, now carried pride in their hearts. They remembered the nights when alien fleets burned their skies, and they remembered how humanity answered with fire of its own. Children grew up reciting stories of the relentless gunships, of the battles fought in the void, of the pilots who never came home. Those stories were no longer tales of despair but of hope, proof that even the small could rise against giants. Across alien worlds, things had changed too. The galaxy watched humanity with wary eyes but also with quiet awe. Where once there had been mockery, now there was respect. Where there had been laughter, now there was silence. Humanity had forced even its enemies to admit the truth. This species was not to be underestimated. But humanity did not seek thrones or crowns. They did not demand tribute. They asked only for dignity, for peace, for the chance to stand among the stars as equals. And in that they showed their greatest strength, not just the power to destroy, but the will to endure, to build, to rise without becoming what they had once fought against. In the end, the legacy of the gunships was not just destruction, it was defiance, it was survival. It was the reminder carved into the hearts of every empire that humanity would never kneel, never break, never vanish. They had come from a small blue world, fragile and overlooked and against all odds. They had changed the destiny of galaxies, and so the story lived on, not in the cold halls of emperors, but in the warmth of homes where families could finally live without fear, under skies that were theirs to claim. The void was vast, but humanity's fire burned brighter than ever, a promise carried forward into every dawn. We will endure, we will rise, and the stars will remember our name.